Sound good? And we're about to go live on YouTube, and then we'll be off and running here. There we go. All right, we're off and running. Charles Moscowitz here, live Monday through Friday, 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Adam Korzeniewski is my guest. He is a former Trump Administration Treasury Department official, Marine Corps veteran. I want to talk a little bit today, Adam, about the business of the weather conditions in Texas and how it's affected the infrastructure there. I think there's a lot of information swirling around about this, some of which may not be quite accurate, but we do know that there's a humanitarian crisis right now in Texas in terms of the people not having power, not having water. There's, people have died already. There's been carbon monoxide poisoning and other conditions, and it's a terrible situation. So, Adam, thanks for joining me. And I guess that my first and I think somewhat obvious question is, where is the Biden administration, right? I mean, this to me looks like Katrina.
Yeah,
what is going on with them?
I hope everybody's sitting down for this one and, not next to anything they can throw. But on February 14th for Valentine's Day, the Department of Energy under the temporary acting secretary under Biden issued an order that yes, the Texas natural gas power plants can exceed their environmental standards, but only to the point of being able to produce energy at $1,500 per megawatt hour, which is normally the price during peak energy prices in Texas is about $100 per megawatt hour, and it normally averages about this time of year around $19, $20. So it's not a meaningful amount of extra production because that's the floor that they can drop the price down to. So basically, the Biden Energy Department just threw the middle finger at Texas. They're like, hey, well, all this energy failure and the up and running plants that you have, you can't produce more.
So you're telling me that the Biden administration coming into power a day or two after it was installed, they actually signed some kind of an executive order limiting the volume of energy that the Texas oil producers, the plants could produce?
So generally speaking, the Department of Energy throttles how much power every power plant in the country can produce, mostly because they don't want these power plants to burn out before their time. These are extremely expensive infrastructure projects, and so they try to keep them both within environmental regulation as well as just a standard operating procedure of kind of a low mid-level hum the whole time, so that they are producing steady electricity, but they're also not overtaxing themselves. So that's the power of the fossil fuel, burning carbon-based fuels, so natural gas, oil, coal, and even nuclear, is that you can increase the amount of power that you produce by throwing more fuel into the fire.
Sure. But yet I would think that there might be a waiver during an emergency. I mean, obviously this is Hurricane Katrina territory. They need to produce more energy.
That was the waiver. It's like it's basically they gave the middle finger to Texas. It was that, hey, you can't produce that much more electricity than what you're already producing.
I see. So they would not let them have an extra waiver to produce more energy.
Right. They basically set the floor so high that it only looks like they provided some sort of guidance on how to manage it rather than actually manage the actual crisis or allow Texas to manage its own crisis.
And this was an executive order that I assume applied to all 50 states, and that it was done before the crisis. So there was, no advance anticipation of the consequences.
Yeah, that's true. So the Energy Department does regulate power output in some ways across the entire country. But this is after the crisis has begun.
Okay.
This is February 14th. I'm discussing is literally Valentine's Day. Is the Biden Energy Department said, hey, you can produce more power, Texas, but not too much. You know, like you can't get those natural gas generators burning so much energy.
That's incredible. So they already knew the crisis was at hand, and yet they put this brake on Texas, and told them you can't produce more energy to deal with the emergency.
Absolutely. And at that point, ERCOT, who's the manager of the Texas power grid, so Texas actually has its own power grid because it's so big.
Right.
And they didn't know how much damage was done to the windmills by this point because it's still cold enough that they haven't thawed. Mm-hmm. So like there was a real question of whether or not they would be able to produce as much power with the windmills that they were expecting. And so there's like a lot of contingencies, a lot of emergencies that they're trying to go through. Mm-hmm. And the Biden Energy Department is like, well, it's too early to tell. Meanwhile, you saw energy prices spike, to 5 figures.
And that was because of the fact that there was not enough energy being produced to meet the emergency needs. So thus the price goes up. But if they had not put in this special order and they allowed the state to function in terms of increasing production to deal with the emergency, there wouldn't have been an increase in price.
Absolutely, and that's the thing too, is that this is almost beyond partisan politics. Mm-hmm. This is spite, and this is the reality. Is like you look at it, ERCOT is a semi-independent agency. It's one of those like permanent bureaucracies that we kind of don't like, but it's also at the same time it's one of the ones that kind of have to be semi-independent because it's a field of experts who know how to run Texas's power. And they have, so like, it's not the governor who asked for it. It's a independent regulatory and energy agency that is technically a nonprofit was asking for it. And these are supposed to be the experts on Texas's power grid and power needs.
So then they basically did this because they don't like Texas for being a blue state. It was strictly out of spite.
Right, and this is kind of like goes into what we sort of talked about last time, which is this policy of deindustrialization and this policy of eroding America as it was a great power nation which could produce its own things. And this is the kind of stuff that they love to do, which is if America can't produce its own material goods, if you can't rely on the power grid, like that's the reason why the Soviets and the Soviet satellite states couldn't really compete with the United States, is that they just couldn't keep up with the energy demands.
And this runs hand in glove, of course, with the cancellation of the XL pipeline and the rejoining of the Paris Climate Accord and all the rest under the guise of so-called, climate change. This is an attempt to shrink the American footprint in terms of our energy independence, and at the same time give a wink and a nod to communist China and Russia and India and other countries to let them go ahead with their dirty energy. Now, I also was surprised to find out that Texas has a pretty large percentage of their energy does come from wind and solar energy, probably bigger than Massachusetts, my own home state. I think it was something like 10 to 12%. And talk about that, and talk about whether or not the wind and solar aspect of their energy, total energy grid, is functioning in this emergency.
Absolutely. So Texas's wind is roughly, like you said, 10 to 12%, but at different parts of the time of the year, the energy output actually could go up to almost a quarter of Texas's total daily energy input, which is, it's more, they try to throttle back the fuel whenever the wind is outperforming, which is just kind of like normal operational standards when you get free energy, basically, the idea is. But so the wind problem is a hugely complex one, and this is why President Trump, I keep calling him the president still, but I have to get out of it.
Once a president, always a president.
Exactly. President Trump saw these giant windmills, and saw it's a real estate play, not an energy play.
Okay.
And he was immediately skeptical, and that's like a lot of people gave him such a hard time about it. Well, there's so much easy money out there, especially in a place like Texas, just to produce windmills on agricultural or former agricultural land. And so they just pop those up on there. And Texas's energy market's fairly deregulated, so the standard is not quite as high for something with windmills, because for the most part, they kind of just like, oh, we're going to protect ourselves by producing more. But most of the windmills are concentrated either in West Texas or in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
And so if there's a storm that hits, that means they actually, like a big enough storm, it actually wipes out significant chunks of it, which is what happened to West Texas in Winter Storm Uri. And it's a very dry climate. And so then this really wet, wintry mix of rain and snow, as everybody from the Northeast is familiar with, it's worse than the snow, comes in and freezes the wind turbines. And this is actually similar enough in a way to what was happening in California in 2020. California is more dependent on solar than wind, and they had the problem of the solar panels were working fine. The problem is that in the summer, the energy demand was just so high, it was out of control high, that you can't produce incrementally more energy out of renewables. These are things that operate fine when they're installed during normal operating procedures. But the power of burning things is that you can just burn more to produce more energy for the most part.
Right. I mean, they're dependent on the atmosphere. I mean, obviously, solar energy isn't going to work at night, and it's not going to, you can't increase it. It just has, and if anything, it's probably decreased by weather conditions. And same thing with wind. It depends on whether or not there's any wind. I mean, here in Boston, where I am, there's a big windmill on the Southeast Expressway, and I used to drive by it twice a day going, because I had a job on the South Shore, and very rarely did I see it move. Now, that's not a condemnation of wind, because I think that it has to do with location and other factors, but it's not the answer. I mean, it's only a part of the grid. And it sounds to me like Texas might have been a little bit more dependent on these fuels, these alternative energy sources, than maybe some other states. Now, I want to ask you, I don't know if you have any background in energy, but it's just a kind of a, maybe sound like a dumb question, but can energy from like a wind turbine or from a solar panel, can it be stored, or is it simply, does it have to be spent at the point of production, at the point where it happens?
So my like real thing I love is industrial policy. So this actually fits neatly into it, and it's sort of like my hobby, I guess, in a way of speaking. So how energy is produced, it's produced very much in like the same kind of sense that you'd be doing for a factory. There is they target the production to match the demand at any given time, and they can actually real time adjust it. And so what they do is they shunt the power into the network, and they prioritize different areas. They shunt it elsewhere if it's excess, or and there's like some storage, but for the most part, like storage is actually very hard to do for this amount of power, because it's depending on metals and acids, and that the battery that would take would be enormous. So for the most part, it's used at the point of production. And if you go onto ERCOT's website, they have probably the best website of the power grids I've seen, at least because it's very simple. You get to see what is their daily expected demand, what is their current demand, what is their current production, and what is their maximum production if everything's cranking at any given time. And so they have they actually tell you like what would be the contingency production in a case of emergencies. And so this is you can't store really energy. It's sort of like a factory. You don't want to necessarily store the things that you produce, because it's just burning a hole through your pocket.
Right. I mean, the technology of storing energy probably is prohibitive. And I mean, I think that there's a couple of municipalities, I think in California, that are experimenting with lithium batteries as a means of powering, but there's all kinds of environmental problems associated with that. I mean, to mine the lithium, and I mean, it's not such a great, it's like those new light bulbs that was supposed to replace the incandescent bulb. They're environmentally worse.
Right.
I mean, I know that I remember once my daughter had one, and it broke in her room, and we had to leave the house practically. I mean, the smoke coming out of that thing. I mean, the incandescent light bulb is safer. It's actually, maybe it might use, I think, a little bit more energy, but it's environmentally speaking, I mean, it's pretty clean. So sometimes these environmental solutions to something, they're not actually good for the environment.
Right, and that's the thing is you have to ask yourself whenever someone tells you about some sort of environmental scheme, you have to ask yourself, is this meant to impoverish the United States, or is this actually trying to save the environment? We don't want to produce so much smoke and crap so the town becomes unlivable.
Right.
At the same time, it's, when you produce lithium batteries, what's happening? Well, in a third world country somewhere, they're using child labor to mine that out of the ground because the United States both refuses to do rare earth metal development and mining itself. Mm-hmm. So we use other third parties to do it. And then when we dispose of it, it goes right back to these places. So it's this kind of neoliberal, bleeding heart way of like British imperialism in like a very abstract sense. It's the perfect, way for a Californian to feel good about exploiting labor overseas.
I see. So they don't care about having slave labor in China or Indonesia. I mean, like what Microsoft frankly does. I mean, to create the smartphone. So thus we have an emergency in Texas. People are in trouble. They're cold. They're suffering. They can't get food and water. Everything is coming to a halt. Has the federal government, putting aside whether or not they prevented Texas from producing the extra energy, what are they doing now? I mean, I remember that President Trump was criticized when a hurricane hit Puerto Rico, even though he went down there. They got money to the place. I mean, they actually ultimately were praised by the Puerto Rican government. But the media totally was, I mean, this is uncaring and cruel. And, they blamed him, just like they did to Bush and Katrina, putting aside the fact that the governor there, who was a partisan Democrat, refused to call him and refused to call out the FEMA because she said, we can handle this ourselves, until it was too late. What is going on now with Texas from a public policy standpoint? Have they called Biden and asked for help? Are there any efforts on the part of the federal government on the ground?
Yeah, so Governor Abbott asked for a declaration of a statewide disaster for Texas.
Yeah.
And the Biden administration didn't grant it. They granted it on the most affected counties, which, you can argue from the perspective of Texas is basically a small country, and it's actually a very big country in of itself.
Sure.
That they have the resources to manage it, which, I don't, that's not my state. I'm not a Texas partisan. So, but at the same time, for the most part, it's being relatively ignored.
Well, it's also a statewide issue. It's not just certain counties. Is that
right? And that's the thing is, if this happened to a different power grid, like the East Coast power grid, which is the largest one in terms of geographic space, it's broken down to several different ones to include the Quebec one, which manages the greater Boston region. Mm-hmm. If they happen to there, you would have federalization of all state assets and a general being appointed to take charge of the logistics situation, because of the fact that it would be cross state lines and that there would be so much outcry from Democratic donors. But that's the thing is the fact that Texas basically has its own power grid because of its raw size allows the Biden people to have it both ways. They can look like they're doing some stuff to help out, but at the same time, they can really kind of nerf any sort of real response.
So, in other words, they haven't really accepted the governor's request for a statewide emergency. They've only, authorized it in certain counties. No.
Yes, in the majority of counties, not the whole entire state. But
Okay.
I mean, there's still real questions like what other damage did this winter storm did? Because with the power being out, basically, pardon me, across most of the major urban centers in these states, well, we hear about that because urban centers have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of news people, and anybody who's lived around journalists know that they love to report on things outside the window, right?
Right. Okay.
But Texas produces a lot of crops and cattle, and we don't know what the impact of any of that is. Like, especially like it's not so much like the adult cattle, like a adult longhorn, but like a calf. Calves are very susceptible to freezing to death, and that's tomorrow's food, and that's tomorrow's various other crops and products. We don't know what the full extent and impact is of this winter storm, and the fact that electricity was down for so long across the state. We don't even know how far, really. Like, I'm sure Texas knows, but at this point, like, there's no real hard reporting, numerically speaking, on how many counties, how many households, how many acres of farms, what is the total impact of the power outage? How many people have had no power right now? And
Right.
That's the thing, is like we won't know. This could actually go up into hundreds of billions of dollars, especially if we did experience cattle failure. I mean, that'd be
absolutely
catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean the broader impact of this, not only on people but on the economy, is probably huge, and it's not known, and we certainly know it's going to be major. So once the state of emergency was accepted in the select counties in Texas, what has the federal government done? I mean, have they? I mean, I remember the criticism that the Bush administration had over Katrina, the daily shrill media about that. He doesn't care about people. And I think they probably made mistakes, but they responded reasonably well. What's going on now with the federal government? Has there been any federal officials going down there? Has there been any kind of demonstration of leadership?
So I know FEMA officials are down there because they do have a mission to at least oversee some of this stuff, just in case they do get called in.
Mm-hmm.
And Department of Energy officials as well, because they're at the power plants. You don't shut down a nuclear reactor without the Department of Energy knowing, which they had to do because the water pipes were starting to freeze.
Right.
But there's really not a lot that's being done. There's kind of this sick, ironic twist of this whole entire meta-political narrative going on here, is that Nancy Pelosi called up General Honore, who is the President Bush's commanding general during the Katrina relief, and instead of like having somebody called up to go help Texas, they call this guy up who is going to launch an inquisition against Republicans and Trump supporters. And so it's
in other words, they're doing they're doing nothing. They just want to, just like
Exactly.
that. They wasted all their first energies on trying to re-impeach Trump after it's like they it reminds me of like in the Middle Ages, when John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. He was executed, and then
Right.
I think it was about 50 years later, the church dug up his body and then burned the bones again and put it back. So I mean, it's kind of like they're focusing their rage on this, and they're just they're doing nothing. Now, one of the criticisms on the part of the left generally is that there's something wrong with Texas in that they have a more privatized utilities system, and that this is responsible. That's to blame for this. And that if it had been maybe a more blue state, I don't know, with the federal government running it or the state, it wouldn't have happened. What do you say to that?
So I've been trying to dig into that, and it's very hard because real estate deals are very complex, and like you got to think of once again solar and wind as real estate deals first, because even though there's an energy developer there, there's a lot of transactions that are going on behind the scenes. And there is some ground to it. The Bush family was very big into deregulating certain parts of Texas. And the current Texas Land Commissioner is George P. Bush, son of Jeb Bush. And he's big into land development. Obviously, it's his job as well. But so there might be something there. At the same time, the reason why it's as deregulated as it is isn't because of some pure libertarian idealism. It's primarily because that they haven't had to go through so many complex layers to build more power plants and source energy and all that. So like a state like New York, where I'm from originally, we have nuclear, we have hydroelectric, major hydroelectric, we have wind, we have solar, sort of. Mm-hmm. We used to have coal, we have natural gas, we had it all. And it's primarily because New York's so old that it's been able to try everything. And it's so geographically multivariate that there's a lot of complexities to it, and the real estate's just expensive relative to Texas. Whereas Texas, there's gas and oil coming out of the ground, relatively speaking,
right?
And it's flat and it's easy to build on for like power plants. So Texas doesn't have to go through quite as much considerations when they build a new power plant. Like where I'm from in upstate New York, half the year is like frozen over. So you would have to like really think about like, okay, can I actually fuel a power plant with coal or natural gas using a train line back before pipes were a big thing. And that's half the year when it's like 10 feet of snow. Well, that's not really a consideration they have to have down in Texas. So that's really kind of the sneaky way of why wind as real estate investment in Texas is so pernicious, is that, well, because it looks good, people get kickbacks. A lot of politicians benefit, both Democrat and Republican. And, for the most part, it's really not a big deal. No one really cares because they could just build windmills and then connect it to a power grid. Mm-hmm. And then, for the most part, 99% of the time, 98% of the time, nothing happens, like other than repairing them. Mm-hmm. But, with them all being built in this really cheap land out in West Texas or in the ocean, or sorry, the Gulf of Mexico in particular, it's, they're putting so many eggs in one basket that they're kind of ignoring the rest of the power grid in terms of infrastructure upgrades.
So in a sense, it sounds like the power grid and the infrastructure is kind of a patchwork of different things, and sort of a quasi-public, quasi-private type situation. Very similar, it reminds me of New Orleans before the Katrina, when you had these little corrupt agencies, each of them running a levee along the lake, and they really weren't doing their job. So, Adam, what do you think going forward, as someone who has a background in public policy and economy and government? What do you see as a prescription going forward for a state like Texas, or for any of the states?
Well, Texas really needs to lead the way here because they do have the resources to actually do it. And also they have the population power. They have a lot of things going for it that a state like California can't do because it refuses to do it. And a state like, somewhere like any other state just doesn't have the sheer size to do it because it's, like I said, it's basically a country in itself. And upgrade the infrastructure. They need to really think about, do they want 10 to a quarter of their power being produced by wind? When the natural gas generators when they started to try to kick them up in terms of production volume during the immediate emergency, they depressurized the line because they're burning so much extra natural gas that the natural gas lines started to freeze at the wellheads. Mm-hmm. Which means that they just can't produce. They couldn't produce enough natural gas out of the ground. The inflow wasn't high enough. So that's another concern. Another concern is that, and they're right now constructing these. There's things called interconnectors that connect Texas to other power grids. There's one south into Mexico, one into East Coast. There's none to the West Coast, which they're right now building a universal interconnector to connect all the power grids, where all three of them meet in Oklahoma. But these are very, very old. These are very old interconnectors. They're just like straight steel rods that are connected with a direct current line in between these two power grids. And because of that, the East Coast couldn't come to the rescue of Texas, which is designed to do. They were supposed to be able to pipe emergency electricity into Texas. But because these lines are so old and the East Coast couldn't spare too much power, and if they spared too much power to Texas, they could have blown the whole entire system. It becomes a real national security interest. And I know a lot of people have discussed it in the past, but we have to be serious about infrastructure upgrades. The United States was built as it became an industrial power and became the global power in the in the world, because of our willingness to do what's called internal improvements. So
that's right. I mean, that's the old American plan from the 19th century. I mean, canals and bridges and interstate infrastructure. And I think in the United States, a lot of that's gotten old. Both political parties have tried to give lip service to doing it. They've thrown money at it, including Trump, and they really haven't done it.
Right, and that's true. We got the closest in the Trump administration. There was just no congressional interest in it, really.
Right.
And that's half the battle. Same thing with our attempt to onshore manufacturing debt. We need like a domestic finance bank to help provide loans for that. We need to rethink how the U.S. government is structured currently in order to get these things done, because otherwise they won't get done. And this is what they want. They want to deindustrialize the U.S.
Well, I mean, even like I remember during Obama's first year, they talked about the so-called stimulus paying for these, quote, shovel-ready projects, right? Most of the money went to governments. I mean, it was all very corrupt. It went to shore up state governments, particularly liberal state governments, like my own state of Massachusetts at the time, because of their shortfall due to the mortgage crisis and the Wall Street implosion. So the money basically went to Wall Street, and it went to keep state and local and federal agencies and governments humming along at their present levels. Very little of it actually went to building structures, and with a shovel ready. I know there was one project that I kind of watched in Quincy, which is a suburb of Boston. It's actually where I'm from. And, they did build a bridge, but it took something like 5 years. I mean, to do something that probably could have been done in 6 months. And, there's a lot of, I assume there was a good deal of graft involved in that, and money going to, basically to political offices. And so, in a way, like, we're corrupted by so many layers of government that really just basically protects its own and protects each other. And you don't have any actual functioning things going on the ground. We don't have the days. Here in Massachusetts, if you drive out, and by the way, I think it's a great thing. You drive to Cape Cod, you cross the Cape Cod Canal. The two bridges were built in 12 months. They were during the FDR administration, which did a good job with that. There were no red tape. They just did it. They put it together. You can't get that now. That would have taken 12 years to build those bridges now. Right.
Well, there's part of the problem with the Republican Party, since I'm coming from the Republican Party on this, is there's an unwillingness to use government. There's a lot of ways to functionally push through red tape, and one of them is just using the powers of the federal government, like the existing powers. The United States government became the manufacturing powerhouse during World War II by fiat and executive order. So we don't have to go absolutely ham on it, but we can just kind of force certain things along.
Right.
And that's sort of what happened with the border wall project. Is once they figured out the ways to get it done, is like it started getting done basically overnight, because they could find preferential contractors and just immediately deal with them through the defense acquisition process.
And all of those things have now come to a halt. The border wall, they have these incredible, treated steel plants where they've got all of the material ready to go. All of that now is just going to sit there and collect dust. And how many tens of thousands of people are going to be out of work while the border continues to be wide open for drug dealers and for criminals and for every other kind of trafficker. And likewise with the XL pipeline, instead of all the infrastructure is now going to sit there collecting moss and rotting. It'll never be able to be rehabilitated. And immediately you got I think it was 12,000 people out of work overnight. Plus, if you add up the whole economic impact, you're talking like hundreds of thousands of people who would have been employed as an ancillary to that project. And instead, the oil is going to be shipped across the border by train and truck, and then probably enriching some big Democrat donor. In fact, I know it is. I'm not going to mention his name. And, just putting money in the pocket of these big oligarchs and these fat cats.
Absolutely. And that's the thing is they're, going right back to what I've been saying the whole time. The goal is to destroy the material economy of the United States so that everybody either works in tech or they work as like some sort of coffee shop host for the tech workers.
Right. And that's nowhere because of the pandemic. But
right.
I mean, Adam, what you're suggesting right now actually is pretty sensational. And you're saying you're saying this as a former Treasury Department official. You've served in the Marines. I mean, you've got a lot of credentials, and you are saying on this program flat out that this present administration has a policy of deindustrializing the United States and of basically ramping down whole elements of our economy and of our industrial production. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it would be harder for me to say that if it wasn't them basically coming out and saying it themselves. Everything from the Paris Accords to the end of America First with the G7 conference to all this, these kinds of things. It's absurd. Like, this is like a nightmare for anybody who cares about, America as a historical thing, right? Because it's like you want to produce your own stuff. You want
not to mention anybody who cares about our own individual future,
right? Exactly.
and our standard of living.
And so far, like their actions, even if they say that they're pro-worker, pro anything, they're just going absolutely hard and as hard in the paint as they can to hurt the yeoman class of America, who relies on the material economy to pay their wages. Now, like you just saw, they're starting to kick off the propaganda for war in Syria. And it's like,
well, that we could predict. They're going to get back into the policy of perpetual war for perpetual peace.
Right.
This was something
that like me who does the fighting, so.
Exactly. I mean, this was exactly what any of us predicted during during the election, that Trump, who was anti-war and who de-escalated foreign wars, kept, forced our allies to pay for their own national defense, and at the same time promoted peace in the world. That's gone. We're going back to there was the historian Charles Austin Beard, who after World War I wrote the book called Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, where he basically set the stage, and he was for it. He set the stage for what would become American policy going forward: international entanglements, transfer of powers to the United Nations and other international groups like the WTO. And basically, we'd become mercenaries for the world. We'd become, this is exactly what we're going back to now. It was easy. I mean, this is as predictable as predicting time. I think it's only going to be a matter, by the end of this year, we're going to be embroiled in more war.
Right. Well, I hope that's not going to happen.
Me too.
But, that's the thing is like one of the things Republicans just don't do is like take their opposition seriously when they tell them something. It's like they just tell you straight up what they're going to do to your face. They're that stone cold that they can just go ahead with what they tell you and just go ahead and do it. And it's something that I think they're too, like, I guess, nice in a way to, like, a way of saying to not understand it. It's like they tell you just straight up, like, hey, like, we're going to turn you into what we did to the British economy, which is financialize it and make it completely dependent upon foreign import. We're going to, we're going to send troops to Syria. We're going to engage in try to engage in saber rattling with Russia, but at the same time, we don't care about the sovereignty of Poland. And it's just like, what? So like you're telling me like you're playing all these like little games of shifting people on the board. It's very sociopathic. And like, I wish I could be wrong about this deindustrialization stuff, but I mean, they've been in office for, Jesus Christ, I guess, part of my language, I guess like 30 days at this point. And what have they done? They've gone absolutely nuts on industrial infrastructure, energy, everything. They've gone.
Well, it's the first thing they did the day they stepped in. They already are deindustrializing the country. That whether they are consciously trying to do that or not, that is de facto exactly what's happening. And you know, it's pretty troubling. I mean, I don't know. We assume that, you know, people by nature assume the best, but yet, you know, because we can't get our mind around somebody who has an alternative motive. But that does seem to be what's going on here, and it's wrong. And what do you think, Adam, in terms, not to get, you know, to veer off a little bit? We've talked about how they're screwing Texas and how they're, you know, the media is basically, you know, kissing up to them and not reporting on this. Instead, they help him finish his sentence. You know, everything is fine. But where do we stand, both as Americans and in other countries in the world, in terms of the genuinely progressive nationalist movement, the development of strong, sovereign national states that operate in the interests of their own people and in concert with other strong national states who likewise are operating in the interests of their own people? Where are we with that? Because it's obviously under assault. We've obviously had some major setbacks. We've had, I don't want to talk about this because I'll get banned on YouTube, but we've had a very unusual election with some rather unusual developments from that, which were a setback to the people. So where are we now with everything?
Well, so in terms of our side of things, we're still kind of shaking off the rust of the last 5 years of not really building institutions ourselves and like not really writing about this enough. But at the same time, it's like now, I mean, I can talk to people who are fairly high level. I mean, I got hired into the Treasury Department under the Trump administration. Like, we're not doing terribly, you know. Like, this is, you know, when I tell people about what Henry Clay said, they're like, "Wow, that's amazing!" Like, I totally agree. And I can go in front of very high level people and explain it, and they agree. On the other hand, I think the other side's desperate. They realize that they've been losing in a way that they thought they weren't going to lose at all. They thought no matter who was in charge that they would still get their things through. And we, you know, like I'll admit it, like we didn't get enough done in that first 4 years. But at the same time, he was still the most anti-neoliberal president since Ulysses S. Grant, and that scares them. And the fact that like you have Macron at least speaking to the rhetoric of it is pretty good sign that the people who are, you know, using neoliberalism as a way to become powerful are at least willing to adopt the rhetoric at the same time. And the people who are true dyed-in-the-wool neoliberals are actually terrified of the consequences of what has been reopened, which is, you know, the American system of political economy, a national spirit that founded America and founded a lot of these countries across the globe. And, you know, there's no, you know, their problem is that they're using China as a way to loot and occupy a lot of these countries. And the thing is, we can just look at China and be like, wow, these guys are ultra nationalists, like in a way that's like would be, you know, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we find abhorrent to actually deal with them, just because they kind of this soft racial supremacism. Now it's like it's okay because it's progressive, right? And so we just have a counterexample of like who should we be like, and then the Chinese just tell us that they read our books. They've read Hamilton, they've read Clay, they've read Abraham Lincoln, and it's like Why don't we just
implementing the American policy when we're moving away from it.
exactly? And I think there's definitely hope, and I think we're going to win just off the fact that people who agree with us tend to have kids, and the people who disagree with us tend to have no kids. We'll eventually outlast them.
But yeah, unless you count the massive influx of cheap labor,
right.
which that combined with leftist organization, these things are taking over states, and then of course you have improprieties. I don't want to say what they are, but we know what they are, and they have to do with governments changing over to new governments. We have to be careful here because we, in this banana republic now, you can't criticize the government in certain ways, and which of course begs the question: is this their last gasp now that they have installed themselves into power, or are they really going to clamp down here because they do control the high ground in the media, in the culture, in business, in economy, and even in the churches?
I think this is the end of the beginning, like our end of our beginning, and like we have a lot more road to go. For them, like they are seeing the potential. They're potentially at the beginning of their end, and so like they'll still have multiple comebacks. They're resilient. They're merciless. At the same time, though, the reason why they're cracking down so hard, the reason why they're digging up whole generals to run their inquisitions, the reason why that they're going so hard on making the military less effective as a military force, but more as a militarized police force, is because of the fact that they're actually scared of it. Like the thing that was, I can't say this on air. One of the decent outcomes that have occurred from an event that occurred probably 40 something days ago was a lot of members came out and said that they were terrified of the National Guard defending them, right? Which is absurd if you're a normal person, because you're like, I know National Guardsmen, they probably are just trying to stay warm the whole time while they're there.
Of course.
It's pretty cold. But they're afraid of the uniform. They're afraid of the flag. They're afraid of like regular people being too close to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that tells you something that they're afraid of the most absurd things because they're slipping. Their grasp on things are slipping. And the reason why you still see riots, even though they're diminished nowadays, is because they let the genie out of the bottle and they can't even control their own shock troops anymore.
Okay, you have that, plus you still have 6,000 National Guards troops in Washington, and the Capitol looks like the green zone in Baghdad.
Yeah, it's silly.
Yeah,
it's you have to have a sense of humor when you walk by these things, because otherwise you get too mad. But you just see every 25 feet there's a guardsman there just trying to stay warm, because during the day it gets up to the 40s and 50s here.
Mm-hmm.
At night it's below the freezing point of water, so it's like they're constantly trying to figure out ways to like just stay comfortable. But it's like so you can't take it too seriously, otherwise you'll go mad. But we live in serious times, and we live in historic times, and we're going to change the world, just one word at a time, one election at a time, and we're going to change. The world's going to change, and they're not going to like it.
Right. And we also have to learn from mistakes, and we have to learn from certain things that happened using certain machines in this last election that might be reformed. I don't want to go into that again because of the junta.
Right.
Adam Korzeniewski, where can people get more information about you and your work? Do you want to give out any websites or anything like that?
I still don't have a website yet, and
okay.
I've been slacking on that. But I'm on Twitter at RealAdamK. So pretty simple.
All right, Adam. Listen, let's stay in touch. I really appreciate it as always.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.